Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Yamisha Sendor in Washington, where right now President Biden is meeting with top congressional leaders at the White House, trying to push an emergency funding request through Congress that would deliver vitally needed wartime aid to Ukraine along with aid to Israel. Right now, getting that aid passed through Congress is contingent on getting a deal on border security. But a bipartisan group of negotiators in the Senate have been working on that for weeks without success. At the same time, lawmakers are working to avoid a partial government shutdown in 2 days. The president invited the so-called Big Four congressional leaders to the White House. That includes Senate Majority Leader Schumer, Minority Leader McConnell, House Speaker Johnson, and Minority Leader Jeffries. Key leaders from congressional committees were also invited. Sources tell NBC News that the president will be particularly focused on the urgent need for additional aid to Ukraine, which comes after the administration's dire warnings last year that aid was running out. Yesterday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with President Zelensky at the annual economic summit in Davos, vowing enduring U.S. support for Ukraine. After that meeting, Sullivan sounded optimistic that Ukraine will get that much-needed assistance soon.
We've got to be able to deliver the necessary resources to Ukraine for the weapons that it needs. President Biden is absolutely laser focused on that. We are seeking to get that done in the coming weeks. And in fact, I continue to believe and express confidence that we will, after a lot of twists and turns, ultimately get there.
That aid package, as we said, is still tied up in border security talks that remain ongoing in the Senate. But complicating matters even more, House Republicans are already signaling that any Senate deal will be dead on arrival in the House unless it mirrors a sweeping border security bill that was passed last year. Ahead of today's White House meeting, Speaker Johnson and Majority Leader Schumer continued to be at odds over that legislation.
We have to secure our own border before we talk about doing anything else. And that's the message I've had since day one. House Republicans are standing on that line. I will tell the president that today. I've been saying it consistently since the moment I was handed this gavel.
But is it H.R. 2 or nothing, sir?
I don't care what you call it. I'm telling you that these elements are important in order to make the change that is necessary.
The hard right, typical of them in the House, have insisted on passing a highly partisan bill, H.R. 2, word for word. That is not bipartisanship. Any agreement on an issue as complex and contentious as the border is going to have support from both sides of the aisle.
But even if Biden and lawmakers reach a deal today on this aid package, congressional leaders are also facing a deadline on another critical issue, passing a short-term funding bill to avoid a partial government shutdown. Joining me now is NBC News' chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander, and NBC News Capitol Hill reporter, Ryan Nobles. So, Peter, these negotiations, as we said, have been going on for weeks and weeks. But it's been months since President Biden met face-to-face with congressional leaders. So how significant is it now that the president is stepping in and getting directly involved in these talks? And what are the major sticking points here?
Yeah, no, you're right. This is actually not going to be that intimate of a meeting. We expect more than 24 individuals to be there, including the president, Speaker Mike Johnson, as well as the Big Four, as you described them, and some top Republicans and Democrats, as well as White House officials, all gathering for a meeting that's intended to focus, the White House says, on Ukraine. But you also heard from Speaker Johnson indicating that he says basically Ukraine is a non-issue until they're able to address the issue of border security. Johnson and President Biden haven't shared a room since October. But this is a real stalemate right now with real urgent needs. According to the White House, I was speaking to a U.S. official only a short time ago on specifically the issue of Ukraine, and they said right now, in their words, that Ukraine is not at 100% of its capabilities right now, and the fact that it is running low on some of the required munitions that it needs to be able to conduct this war against Russia right now. Specifically, they talk about anti-armor capabilities. They talk about air defense interceptors necessary to fight off the regular daily bombardment from the Russians right now, as well as other munitions that are required at this time. The president, though, from the very beginning, did tie this all up in one big bow. $110 billion he initially requested that he said would address the issues of Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan as well, and border security. And it is that issue of border security that does appear to be the holdup today. The president indicating that he is open to making some key concessions. Among those places where he may need to make concessions right now are efforts to make it more difficult to gain asylum in the United States, as Republicans have been calling for. And separate from that, their desire to restrict the use of an immigration policy known as humanitarian parole right now. Again, bipartisan consensus, the desire, the effort at that appears to have dimmed, though, right now, with House Speaker Mike Johnson indicating that effectively those Ukraine efforts are dead on arrival. The Senate negotiations dead on arrival unless they're able to pursue some of these more strict efforts on border policy that the House Republicans want.
Well, Peter, Peter, as you said, the White House had this big bow on all of this. Is there any regret there that they tied all this together? And could, if they don't reach a deal, could this possibly hurt President Biden, who's, of course, trying to run for re-election?
Well, you asked two good questions there. I think to the second one first, I mean, the president does face a real unique challenge right now, right? Because in many ways, his political prospects, they are impacted by a lot of different domestic issues as well. But in terms of foreign policy, his prospects are impacted by two wars that the U.S. is not leading. The war between Ukraine and Russia. The U.S. is not a direct party in that, and separately the war between Hamas and Israel. So the president does face a real unique challenge as it relates to both the issues of Israel and Ukraine and the provision of aid to them right now. The question has been asked of this White House if the president regrets, if White House aides regretting tie these all up together. But President Biden, from the very beginning, on day one, as the White House has repeatedly told us, called for efforts at comprehensive immigration reform. Of course, this is one of the most challenging issues in all of Washington right now, as best indicated by this new stalemate that the president's facing at this time.
And Ryan, of course, there's Speaker Johnson, who obviously wants to talk about the border. He wants to see that hardline immigration bill, dubbed H.R. 2, pass. Could this meeting at the White House get him to compromise?
Well, it's a great question, Yamiche. And when you take into account, as Peter pointed out, that there could be 24 people or more in this room, really the only two that matter in the real context of whether or not this deal is going to get done is the President of the United States and the Speaker of the House. There seems to be at least movement, progress towards this idea of the Senate coming to a deal with Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, getting the votes necessary to get it out of the Senate. And there's likely even enough votes if the bill makes its way to the House. The question is, will the Speaker be willing to take on the most conservative members of his caucus and actually put the bill on the floor? And maybe that's part of what this conversation will be about at the White House. You know, the members of the Republican Party in the House are much less concerned about Ukraine and Ukraine aid. They're far more concerned about the border. There are many Republican members that are opposed to Ukraine aid, but there's a larger group that would be willing to vote for Ukraine funding if it's tied to a border security package that they believe not only contains more funding, but the substantive policy changes that they want. The question is, how will they receive this package that ultimately makes its way out of the Senate? There's really only one person in that room that's going to know the answer to that question today, and that's the Speaker of the House.
A lot of questions there, but there's also, of course, the question of the partial government shutdown that is looming. There's likely a deal here to extend government funding to March, but where do things stand right now? Ryan.
Yamiche, you know, it's about vibes, right, when it comes to a government shutdown, and I've covered so many of these. The vibes right now are not one of much anxiety. There does appear to be a path forward to extend funding at least through the beginning of March, and it seems as though there will be enough votes in both the House and Senate to get that done. Speaker Johnson, who had said on many different occasions that he was done passing these short-term spending bills, kind of recalibrated his stance on that during his press avail today and told us that he's only in favor of these short-term spending plans if he sees progress in these negotiations. They feel like there's progress, and it seems very likely that they'll get something passed before the deadline on Friday.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan and Peter. It's a lot of great reporting there. We're now going to hear from one of the top Democrats in that meeting later this hour. Congressman Greg Meeks, ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, will be with us straight out of that meeting. As we've been discussing this, getting Congress to pass more aid to Ukraine is a key priority for the administration. The last security assistance package for Ukraine was announced last month. The White House says that was the last one they were able to authorize and that no new package is in the works. Joining me now is the Pentagon's Deputy Press Secretary, Sabrina Singh. Sabrina, thank you so much for being here. Now, at the end of last year, the White House was sounding the alarm and saying that money for Ukraine will run out at the end of the year. Where do things stand right now? Has there been a sort of lapse in getting equipment, aid, ammo to Ukraine?
Hey, thanks, Yamiche. Always good to be with you. I mean, exactly what you said, and as your correspondent was laying out, the last aid package we gave to Ukraine, one of our presidential drawdown authorities, was December 27th. Since then, there have been no PDAs that have come off our shelves and gone to Ukraine or been announced to Ukraine since that time. And that's why we've urged, and you've heard from the Secretary, from the President, urged Congress to pass our urgent supplemental request that not only allows us to backfill and restock our shelves, but allows us to also continue to flow aid to Ukraine, as they are in a critical point in their fight. And as you well know, and I know you've reported on this, we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of this war. The Ukrainians have made incredible gains, but are still in a tough fight in the east and the south. And so they need all the equipment, the capabilities that we can provide. And it's not just the United States. Of course, we have our allies and partners around the world helping Ukraine, but certainly the United States wants to remain a stringent supporter of Ukraine, and we want to make sure that we see that supplemental package get through.
And Sabrina, you said we're at a critical point. I want to ask you to dig in a little bit more on how successful Ukraine has been. Have they been able to make significant gains with all the aid that they've gotten?
Absolutely. I mean, 2 years ago, we were talking about potentially the fall of Kyiv. Then we were talking about the potential fall of Kharkiv. And now we were talking about the potential fall of Kherson. And the Ukrainians have been diligent and incredibly powerful in using the capabilities that the United States, other allies and partners have been able to provide, and continue to push the Russian forces back into the east and south. And of course, the fight remains. It's still hard. We know the Russians used last winter to lay very complex minefields that the Ukrainians did have a hard time and continue to have a tough time getting through. But we can't give up on them, and they're not giving up. And that's why we continue to urge Congress to pass that supplemental package so that we can continue to deliver the much-needed capabilities to the battlefield that Ukraine needs every single day.
And Sabrina, I will also turn now to the Middle East, which is, of course, another critical issue and another part of the world that we're watching very closely. The U.S. recently carried out strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen. Did those strikes, I want to ask you, significantly degrade their capabilities? What kind of impact did they have?
We're confident in the degradation that we were able to do to the Houthis' capabilities, not just on our strikes on January 11th, but the subsequent more dynamic strikes that we were able to take last week and just yesterday. Again, we haven't decimated all of the Houthis' capabilities. We know that they still retain some. We've seen them respond in lower scale incidents, which is why you're going to continue to see this department assess what more needs to be done. But we feel confident in what we were able to strike and the damage we were able to inflict on their own capabilities.
I want to stick with the Houthis. The administration, of course, today announced that it was designating the Houthis as specifically designated global terrorists. It's a separate from the more severe designation of a foreign terrorist group. How involved was the Pentagon in those discussions, and why not redesignate these Houthis on both lists and not just one?
Well, when it comes to designation, that's really led by the State Department. Again, it's critically important at a time when Yemen has had years of civil war that humanitarian aid continue to be able to flow in. And the Yemeni people shouldn't be hurt or disadvantaged because of the actions of the Houthis. We know Yemen needs critical aid, humanitarian aid. So that's why you see the designation and what was announced by the administration today.
And the administration has also said that this is really also about Iran. So I want to ask, do we really need to deter Iran? And what is the Pentagon doing to really increase pressure there?
Well, you saw early on from October 7th and moving forward, you saw the secretary really be very forward-leaning on the fact that we do not want to see what's happening in Israel spill into a regional conflict and have other actors in the region take advantage of what's happening in Israel. And so we surged the USS Ford to the Eastern Med. We surged another carrier strike group also into the CENTCOM area of Central Command. And so you had two carrier strike groups, an incredible show of capability and strength within the region. And again, in December, the secretary was in the region and announced the formation of Operation Prosperity Guardian, which brings together over 20 nations, really to focus on the Red Sea and to ensure that commercial vessels, we know that 15% of the world's commerce flows through the Red Sea, ensure that merchants can sail freely and openly through the Red Sea, and ensure that this coalition together upholds the international rules-based order.
And speaking of the Secretary Austin, he was just released from the hospital this week. Has he been able to resume all of his duties? And has he spoken to the president since being discharged?
He has. He's been able to resume all full duties. They spoke last Friday. He's in good spirits. He's back home. Of course, we're wishing him a speedy recovery and looking forward to welcoming here back in the Pentagon.
Well, Sabrina Singh, thank you so much for joining us from the Pentagon.
Thanks, Yamiche.
And coming up, court in the morning and courting votes in the evening. The former president clashing with a judge in a defamation trial in New York as he gets ready to hit the campaign trail in New Hampshire. Plus, Donald Trump and Nikki Haley take aim at each other with just days to go before the New Hampshire primary. We're on the ground in the state next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Today, things got heated in a New York courtroom on day 2 of former President Donald Trump's defamation trial brought by writer E. Jean Carroll. The judge threatened to bar Trump from the courtroom because of his vocal objections and complaints. Trump then responded to that warning, telling the judge, quote, "I would love it." Trump later posted attacks against the judge on social media, calling him abusive and rude. Carroll testified in the defamation trial today. The former Elle magazine advice columnist has accused Trump of sexually assaulting her decades ago. Last May, a civil grand jury found him responsible for the assault. NBC's Rahima Ellis has been covering the trial and joins me now. Rahima, thank you so much for being here. So what went on inside this courtroom today? Things got a little wild, so tell us about this exchange.
Well, Judge Lewis Kaplan had been sparring and having exchanges, if you will, all morning during this case with Trump's attorney, Alina Abba. He had been telling her when to sit down, when to stand up, when she should make objections or when her objections were not appropriate. At one point when he told her to sit down, she said to him she didn't like the way that he was speaking to her and that he probably wouldn't speak to other attorneys that way. On a motion that she was making, he continued to deny the motion and then told her again to sit down. At different points, the former President Trump could be heard making his remarks. At one point, he called the judge a nasty guy. And one of the things that the judge had said at the beginning of this case yesterday, when they were determining jurors for the case, the judge made it very, very clear that there were not to be any kind of remarks made that were objectionable remarks that could be heard within the earshot of the jurors. So when there was a break, when the jurors were not in the room, the judge received some comments from E. Jean Carroll's attorneys who were disturbed that Mr. Trump was making these various kinds of remarks. And so the judge admonished him. And that's when one of the most serious references of the judge suggesting that he could boot him out of the courtroom if he continued to make these kind of remarks. The judge essentially saying that he wasn't going to stand for it, that he was setting some tight rules.
I mean, what a scene in that courtroom. I also want to ask you about the testimony of E. Jean Carroll. Part of what Trump was doing was reacting to her testimony. So what exactly did she say?
One of the things she said, well, she started out talking about who she was. She's an 80-year-old woman who said that she came from a small Midwestern town, and one of her dreams was to be in the big city. She made it to the big city and to be a big-time writer, if you will. She wrote for Vanity Fair, Rolling Stone, and even was a writer at points for Saturday Night Live. She wrote several books. And she talked about how her life ended and her world changed when in 2019, Donald Trump from the Oval Office made remarks about her allegation that he had engaged in sexual assault of her. And she said, with that comment coming from the most powerful person in the world, from the White House, from the Oval Office, it ended her world as she knew it. She got death threats. She got rape threats. She said she had to change her whole life. There were messages on her voicemail that were constantly threatening her. And her life just changed. She said also that she had been an advice column writer, and she would get 200 requests at a point. It went down to just 2. And this, she said, was all a direct result of how the former president was making these disparaging remarks about her, and those who follow Mr. Trump were following his lead.
We'll certainly be keeping our eye on that case and the number of cases that are involving the former president, Rahima Ellis. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And turning now to the campaign trail, where we're less than a week away from the New Hampshire Republican primary, where the same Donald Trump, who was spending the day and is spending the day in court, that he is hoping now to dominate and have another performance like after he won Iowa's caucuses in a landslide victory. Polls show he faces a tougher fight next week, which perhaps explains his barrage of attacks on his top rival in the state, his former UN ambassador, Nikki Haley. This morning on social media, he appeared to mock the ethnic origins of Nikki Haley's first name, Nimerata. That comes after he amplified false claims about her eligibility to run for president tied to her heritage, echoing the birther conspiracy and racist lies Trump promoted about former President Barack Obama. Trump also shared an image of Haley altered to make her look like former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Joining me now on the ground in New Hampshire, where things are heating up, is NBC's Shaquille Brewster. Shaq, thank you so much for being here. So, of course, former President Trump is out attacking Nikki Haley on social media. Tell us exactly what is going on here and why he's zeroing in on her in this moment.
Yeah, he's definitely zeroing in on her, and I think that's just abundantly clear at this point. You know, the former president has a habit of showing and telling people what he's thinking by just talking about it. What he's posts about, you could tell that's what's top of mind for him. And you heard him even mention her and attack her on stage last night at one of his rallies. It was his first rally in New Hampshire since his dominant performance in Iowa. And listen to a little bit of how he attacked Ambassador Haley.
I do want to talk about Nikki because this perception that she's gone up. But I worked with her for a long time, and she was okay. Not great. She was not great. She's not tough enough to deal with these people. I will tell you that. She's not tough enough. So I moved her to the United Nations, and honestly, she was not a good negotiator. She was not a good negotiator. Now she likes to talk about when I negotiated with China. I negotiated with China. I did all of it.
There you hear him going after her for someone he appointed when he was president. And one of the reasons why you're starting to see these attacks and you're hearing these attacks step up is because this race is closer. While former President Trump very clearly has a lead in the state of New Hampshire, we got a new snapshot just today. He's at about 50% in New Hampshire, about 16 points ahead of Nikki Haley. I should also note that New Hampshire is a state in which it's very hard to actually poll and get an accurate depiction of how voters feel, and that's because of those undeclared or independent voters who can choose to participate in the Republican primary. But those numbers that you see on screen are both tighter than the margin that we saw in Iowa and tighter than the margins that we saw in polling leading into Iowa. So if you combine that with his campaign schedule, which is pretty aggressive compared to what we normally see from the former president, it's clear he's at least concerned, or he wants to make sure he's really giving Nikki Haley a fight in this state where you see it's one of her best chances or opportunities to possibly beat him.
And Shaq, as you're saying that Trump wants to give her one of his best fights, he's using Nikki Haley's first name, Nimerata, in a similar way that he used former President Obama's middle name, Hussein. Is there any penalty at all for going too far in this Republican primary?
It doesn't appear to be at this point. I mean, we've heard this kind of rhetoric from former President Trump. I'll tell you, it's not something that many voters have been talking to me about or mentioning when they're talking about supporting former President Trump or even supporting Nikki Haley. I think a lot of this is baked into New Hampshire. People have their opinions. Former President Trump is a known figure. So for those of voters who are supporting him, it's because of his economic record or specific things that people can point to during his presidency. And for those who are looking at other candidates considering supporting Haley, it's because many of them say they're sick of Trump. They want to move on from the former president. A lot of that is all baked into their evaluation of this race. And those specific comments that you're hearing from him, specifically with him referencing her background and heritage, it doesn't seem to be breaking through to the everyday voter here, Yamiche.
Well, we're going to continue to watch that as polls show that former President Trump is still looking strong there. So, Shaq, thank you for your reporting. And speaking of the New Hampshire primary, tune in Tuesday night for special election night coverage starting at 7 p.m. Eastern right here on NBC News Now. Up next, backing Trump. Another Republican senator and former Trump rival throws his support behind the 2024 frontrunner. That endorsement and more developments on the trail. The panel's up next. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
I'm a big believer in letting democracy play out. Well, last night it played out, and I got to say, Trump's victory was across the board. He won 51% of the vote. He won 98 of the counties. Congratulations to President Trump on that dominating victory. And at this point, I believe this race is over. So I am proud to endorse Donald Trump for President of the United States.
Welcome back. That was Republican Senator Ted Cruz throwing his support behind former President Donald Trump after Monday's Iowa caucuses. Cruz, of course, has had a notoriously complicated relationship with Donald Trump. Cruz called Trump a pathological liar and fraud during Cruz's unsuccessful primary campaign against Trump in 2016. But with Cruz in his corner, again, Trump now has endorsements from 25 Senate Republicans. That's more than half the conference, including his other 2016 rival, Marco Rubio. Joining me now on set is Eugene Scott, senior politics reporter at Axios, Democratic strategist Stephanie Shriok, and Matthew Continetti, director of domestic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute and a columnist for Commentary magazine. So thank you all for being here. Eugene, it took one primary, literally one primary, and Republicans are just lining up. Does this really show that Trump has just taken over the party and is rolling through?
Yeah, and I mean, that was largely obvious before now. We knew that he was going to show out strongly at this this caucus, and primary he's expected to have a similar showing in the primary. We'll see what happens with DeSantis and Haley. That right there is worth, I think, paying a lot of attention to. But I don't know that that's going to lead to a lot of change coming from GOP lawmakers.
What do you make, though, of the idea? We call Ted Cruz's relationship with him complicated. There's a lot of things that Trump has said about Ted Cruz's family. You think of other Republicans who came out saying, we could not back this person after January 6th. What do you make of this transformation of the GOP in the image of Trump? We say it all the time, but it is really striking.
It is, but I think what we have from Cruz is similar to what we've had from Lindsey Graham and some other Republican lawmakers who said they're looking at their voters and the people who sent them to Washington and want to get behind a leader that they believe that the people who support them support.
And, Matt, I want to put something up that Chuck Todd, of course, former moderator of Meet the Press, wrote for us today. He wrote, Trump's no hijacker of the GOP. He is the Republican Party. And to the chagrin of a lot of small government conservatives in my orbit, he has also redefined the very definition of the word conservative in the modern political dictionary. So with all that we've seen, what do you make of Chuck's thesis here?
I think it's pretty compelling. I think Donald Trump realigned American politics on the basis of educational attainment. And he turned the Republican Party into a working class party in the sense that Republican politics are now dominated by white voters without college degrees. Those are the so-called poorly educated that he referenced in the Nevada caucus way back in 2016. He loved the poorly educated. They're his base, and they are more and more an important part, the central part of the Republican Party. I think that's changed American politics, and it's made candidates like Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis, who are movement conservatives by and large, or would have been even 10 years ago, now out of sorts with the Trump Republicans.
And Stephanie, what Matt's saying, you think of sort of the non-educated or the poorly educated. Nikki Haley is going after independents in New Hampshire, but if she can't do that, is this fight all but over?
Well, I thought this fight was over before it even started. So I felt like it was going to be Donald Trump's from the beginning. Now, New Hampshire's an interesting dynamic because it's open. So you could have a flood of independents coming in. You might even have some Democrats because there's nothing going on that side trying to change some dynamics there. I wouldn't expect a huge amount of Democrats to jump in there. And I think you've already seen the polling. I mean, he's rolling in at 50. I can't imagine him losing ground. I think the question is how close can she get to him? I still think she has nowhere to go after New Hampshire.
Nowhere to go. That's what some people would say about him, and maybe also about Nikki Haley, maybe Ron DeSantis, too. Eugene, I want to play something that Donald Trump said in New Hampshire yesterday. Take a listen.
Nikki Haley, in particular, is counting on the Democrats and liberals to infiltrate your Republican primary. You know that. That's what's happening. You have a group of people coming in that are not Republicans, and it's artificially boosting her numbers here, although we're still leading her by a lot.
So, Eugene, at some level, that might be right. The independents, I read, make up the largest voting bloc in New Hampshire. But how does Nikki Haley thread this needle? She wants to, of course, run and get conservatives, but she also wants to go after independents.
Well, I mean, she has been trying to distinguish herself from Trump without hurting people who support Trump. And it's been very difficult. It hasn't led to a strong showing, or at least as strong as she would have liked. But she keeps making the case that she does have more support than what these polls suggest. And I guess we'll see for sure in New Hampshire, and certainly, to your point, afterwards in these states where the Republican Party is far more right than what she seems to be putting forward.
Could all of this sort of outreach to all these different groups, could it hurt her ultimately in the end, Matt?
Oh, I think you heard the reaction from the crowd there where Trump was saying that the Democrats are trying to infiltrate your Republican primary. There were big boos. And that, I think, will rally a lot of Republicans to Trump's side. Nikki Haley's only chance, though, is, as we said, a large number of independents vote in this primary, and they vote for her as the candidate who is not Trump. That might be enough to get her close in New Hampshire. I don't think it will be enough in South Carolina, which is a month away, remember. So this race could be settled by the end of next Tuesday.
Of course, South Carolina being the state where she came from, so that would be a very big loss if she loses there. Stephanie, at some level, there's some thought that maybe Dean Phillips, who we don't talk about often, but Dean Phillips and Nikki Haley, that they might be going after the same voters. What are your thoughts on that?
I would say that Dean Phillips might be trying to go after those voters, but the whole focus in New Hampshire is going to be this Republican primary. And if independents are going to engage, they're going to engage in the Republican side in probably a last-ditch effort to lift somebody up other than Trump. But I do think it's a last-ditch effort. She's going to run out of money rapidly after this. I think Ron DeSantis is in the same situation, probably even sooner. And making it 4 weeks in a presidential primary operation, that is an eternity.
Yeah, I do think if she wins, she has the runway in South Carolina.
She has to win or come really, really, really close to get enough resources. But South Carolina is fertile territory for him, for Donald Trump. That is really his community, his base. It doesn't matter if she was governor there or not. That is not the point. He was their president. And that's who they're going to vote for, because they've already voted for him a couple times.
And Eugene, I want to bring you in because as we talk about Nikki Haley, there's these digs that Donald Trump are making at her, using her name Nimarata, seemingly going after her Indian heritage. He already had questioned whether or not she was eligible to run for president, which of course she is. Does it help her at all to go after and try to defend herself on this? Could it help her at all in the primary election?
I mean, not with the voters that Trump is talking to. The voters that message resonates with share his nativist politics and don't want someone like her leading their party. They've had the opportunity multiple times in other primaries to pick someone who is more reflective of perhaps the diversity of this country, following, that autopsy that the GOP did, following the Romney-Obama race that said they want someone who maybe looks more like Nikki Haley, and ultimately they chose Donald Trump.
I mean, that is a long, I get to think about where they have gone, the whole party since then. And it wasn't just Trump hijacking the party or taking over the party. The party was ready. The base of the party was looking for something different, and using race baiting and all of this nativist language has just, with fear and anger, motivated a huge movement around Trump. And it is the Republican Party of today. There's a group that don't like it, but they like power, so they'll stand by him, just as we saw Ted Cruz today.
Well, Matt, as I bring up Ted Cruz, I also want to bring up Ron DeSantis. He went straight from Iowa to South Carolina. What do you make of that and his standing in the race?
Well, the clearest explanation is he has nowhere to go in New Hampshire, so South Carolina would be his only bet. But it's hard to see how he gets from X to Y, having come in a distant second in Iowa. I do think if Haley, slipping the bounds of reality here, if Haley does somehow win in New Hampshire, that does keep the race going for a month. And there I think it's interesting. DeSantis's presence in the race in South Carolina could actually take some Trump voters away from the former president and maybe help Nikki Haley earn another 2-3 points. Will it be enough? Probably not. But like I said, I'm living under delusions that this is a plausible scenario.
Well, Matt, I'll ask you maybe about something else that might be a little, people might see as delusional. Could any of the court cases hurt Donald Trump when you think about the fact that he was just outside the court, it was just in court in New York, the judge threatening to ban him from court because he was going on so badly? But your thoughts?
Well, I don't think any of the court cases will hurt him in the Republican primary, but they will hurt him in the general election. As soon as this nomination is sewn up, everyone's attention will turn to the various courtrooms in which Donald Trump will be present or not present, and that will dominate the election until November.
Eugene?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen polling that said about 2/3 of Republicans do not have a problem with backing Trump if he's convicted. That still leaves 1/3 of people, right? That's a significant percentage. And I, expect the Biden campaign to take advantage of that.
Yeah, well, a lot to talk about. Eugene, Stephanie, Matt, thank you so much for coming on. And after the break, America's mayors descend on Washington as cities struggle to confront issues of anti-Semitism, immigration, homelessness, and more. Two top mayors will join me next on set. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Turning now to the Mideast. The White House says, quote, serious and intensive discussions are ongoing towards a deal to release some hostages being held in Gaza. It comes as a separate agreement has been struck to deliver much-needed medicine to the Israeli hostages being held by Hamas in exchange for additional medicine and humanitarian aid for Palestinian civilians inside Gaza. Israel, meanwhile, says it has ended the intensive phase of its operations in northern Gaza and says it will do the same in southern Gaza soon as well. Welcome back. The Israel-Hamas war has triggered a wave of anti-Semitic incidents here in the U.S., according to the ADL, which is reporting a 360% increase in incidents since the war began. That spike is one of the focuses of the United States Conference of Mayors winter meeting, which begins today here in Washington. I'm joined now by two mayors leading those efforts. Ron Nirenberg is from San Antonio and David Holt of Oklahoma City. So thank you so much both for being here. So I want to start first with this idea that neither of you, it sounds like, have large Jewish communities. Of course, you're both passionate about this issue. So why were you tapped to lead this effort? I'll start with you.
Well, and I'll defer somewhat to my colleague from San Antonio who really started this work, but I got into it in 2021, 2022, and you're right. I mean, I don't have a large Jewish community in Oklahoma City, relatively, but I certainly have a passionate one, and I've been engaged in these issues for many, many years in many public service roles. But I think what I bring to the table, perhaps, is a unique understanding that comes with being the mayor of Oklahoma City about what happens when you dehumanize people. Yeah. We have a scar in our downtown that reminds us of the ultimate outcome to that type of behavior. So I always think it's kind of an obligation of anybody from Oklahoma City to carry forward the message against hate, against bigotry, and I was honored when the conference asked me to be a part of this in 2022, and we have worked together to create a compact with the ADL, which we presented at the White House in 2022, that now over 200 mayors have signed.
And Mayor Nirenberg, I want to ask you, what's the mood in your community and in communities maybe across the country, since I know you're in touch with other mayors, when it comes to the fear that the Jewish communities are feeling given all the anti-Semitic attacks?
Well, there is a certain level of trauma that you have to recognize, and one of the chief responsibilities that any mayor has is to solve problems. So as it relates to the rise of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Black, anti-Latino, xenophobia, this is a real concern for us, and our focus has been how do we ease that trauma and focus on collective education and bringing communities together. So I'm very proud to be part of an effort at the U.S. Conference of Mayors that really began through a Center for Compassionate and Equitable Cities and Businesses that was created out of the wake of the Charlottesville incidents and the violence we saw, racial violence there. Conference of Mayors brought together cities that are Republican and Democrat and recognized this problem of rising hate. And we created efforts like this compact that now has a 10-point commitment from all the mayors in the country to address this and really deal with these issues that are becoming so much a part of our communities. There's been an alarming rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, in particular as a result of what's happening in the Middle East. But we can do our efforts at the local level to buck that trend and bring our communities together.
It's so important that you bring up, of course, what happened in Charlottesville, but also anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. I want to play for you some sound because my colleague, Tom Yamis, he spoke to two Palestinian college students, 20-year-olds, who were shot in Burlington, Vermont late last year. Take a listen to that interview.
Was your mind sort of like comprehending this is happening in Burlington, Vermont to me?
Not that I'd always expected something like this to happen, but something like this, you know, growing up in Palestine, this was something that I'd always thought was possible.
But did you think it happened here?
Not really, no. I definitely expected it would happen to me in like the West Bank in Palestine, but not in Vermont.
Mayor Holt, what do you think when you see that? Have you seen an increase in hate against Muslims as well as you have said against Jews? And what's the role that you think mayors can play in stopping hate against both those groups?
Well, I think we've certainly seen it on a national level. And, you know, I think in Oklahoma City, mayors and any other person of public stature has to speak out against all forms of hate and bigotry, regardless of what your position might be on foreign policy. Like, there's no place for that type of activity, and it can't be countenanced in any way in your community. I think we're blessed in Oklahoma City with a unique political culture that recognizes a lot of what I've just been saying, especially going back to the bombing in 1995. And so our first city council meeting after October 7th, we had kind of the most well-known imam in our community and one of our rabbis come jointly together to our council meeting and show solidarity and support for each other as human beings, as residents of our city. I'm sure they have different opinions about what's going on in Israel and in the West Bank, but they had, and in Gaza, but they were focused on making sure that people in Oklahoma City understood that we're all human beings. We all live far away from the Middle East, and we've got to live together. And it was really inspiring, and I hope we'll continue to carry that ethos forward.
Mayor Nirenberg, could you jump in here and give your thoughts on what Mayor Holt is talking about here, and also add what role maybe the private sector has to play in all of this?
Yeah, well, I think there's a role for every sector, and we are blessed in San Antonio to have a very strong interfaith community and interfaith dialogue, and we've created an initiative called Compassionate San Antonio that really leads through compassion and builds competencies and skill sets in compassion, because that's part of our DNA, is to treat others the way we want to be treated and not treat others the way we don't want to be treated. We recently launched through the U.S. Conference of Mayors and in partnership with the City of San Antonio and Alamo Colleges, a program that helps do that nationwide for free called Compassionate USA. And people can go to compassionateusa.org. We've got hundreds of partners and organizations that are now learning those skill sets and competencies to help prevent, to help intervene, and to help build peace and understanding through collective action.
And I want to stick with you because your city has also it's been dealing with a surge of migrants. What have the conversations been like between you and the governor there?
Well, I'll just be candid. The governor has only stoked the flames of hatred and xenophobia through his actions, his rhetoric, and his policies. We've had a policy now passed that essentially gives open invitation for any law enforcement agency to stop people just for suspicion of being in the country illegally. So we know that's an open door to racial profiling. But I will tell you that in my community, we have dealt with the migration issue up front for many, many years. And in the last couple of years, we've seen a surge of migrants. We've had 600,000 migrants come through San Antonio since January 2021. And I've promised my community three things. We're going to maintain order, we're going to protect public safety, and we're going to treat people with basic dignity and humanity. We've been able to do that and deal with these issues. What we need is the federal government to do its job, for Congress to do its job and deal with comprehensive immigration reform, but also provide local communities in the United States that are dealing with this migration issue the resources necessary to do what I just said: public safety, maintain order, and treat people with common decency and humanity. Ultimately, the vast majority of folks that are coming across are looking for work opportunities, and they lack that ability because of federal law.
Well, an important conversation on how the federal policy is dealing and having impact on the local level. So thank you so much, Mayor Nirenberg, Mayor Holt. I really appreciate you both being on.
Thank you.
And still to come, Congressman Meeks, fresh off his meeting with President Biden and top congressional leaders. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The meeting between congressional leaders and the White House just wrapped up. Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson just spoke to reporters saying that the border remained his conference's top priority. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said there was wide-scale agreement in the importance of addressing the issue of aid to Ukraine and the border, and sounded a bit more optimistic about the state of the talks. I'm joined now by Congressman Gregory Meeks, ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who just walked out of that meeting. So thank you so much for joining us. So how productive was today's meeting?
Well, I think it was a good conversation, and of course the devil's in the details and what takes place next. I think it was basically an agreement that folks had around the table, understanding the significance and the importance of funding for Ukraine and funding for Taiwan, funding for Israel and humanitarian aid, as well as the border. The devil is in the details, though, going back, and that. So I think that where we ultimately ended up was that we must do both border security and Ukraine in a bipartisan way. And so I hope that the House majority joins the Senate in the negotiations, and we, were told that we expect the Senate is very close to coming up to some agreement, and so we wait and see what happens there. But I think that was something that was clear. The Senate is getting close in a bipartisan way to come up with a deal that they hope will get to us and bring it over to the House within the next week or two.
We said that it sounds like there's something coming close. I want to talk to you specifically. Take us into the meeting. What was the mood among Republicans in particular?
Well, I think that, especially with Speaker Johnson, his thing was, the border. But I think that as we went around the room, that there was an agreement of the significance and the importance of Ukraine so that we could make sure that Putin doesn't win. And so folks acknowledged that. But also there was with the Speaker and many of the Republicans, especially on the House side, saying that they didn't think that they could do anything without the border. But in the room, I don't think anybody said do anything without the border. There was a consensus that we had to do something on the border, but we have to do Ukraine, and we have to do it in a timely fashion. So it was, Democrats and Republicans having an open and I think honest conversation about it. And ultimately, I think that we'll see what if or when, I should say, the Senate comes up with the bill that they have been negotiating in a bipartisan manner, and hopefully we can get something done in which no one's going to get everything that they wanted.
Well, Congressman, are you more confident now that you've been in that meeting, that you saw the way Republicans and Democrats were talking to you? Are you more confident now that an agreement can be reached on this supplemental aid?
Well, I'm more confident now that the Senate will have an agreement in a bipartisan way. I'm still a little bit, to be quite honest with you, concerned about what we will do on the House, because I've seen how a number of the Republicans do not want to move unless we're just talking about H.R. 2. And I don't think that we're going to have an agreement if they continue to take that position. If they move from that and we have some actual conversation and dialogue, because there's some things that are very important to Democrats also as it pertains to the border, then I think then I would be more optimistic. So I'm optimistic that the Senate is going to do something. I'm still waiting to see, or still somewhat pessimistic about what happens on the House side. I would hope that they would move from just H.R. 2 and the draconian bill that they were putting forward, and there will be give and take and an honest conversation between the House majority along with the House minority, and then work closely with the Senate.
And Senator Schumer said that there were some people in the room in that meeting that you just walked out of that said that lawmakers needed to do the border first. What is your sense of that?
Well, I think that, and Senator Schumer said in the end of the meeting, and I agree with him, that listening to the meeting, it can't be the border first. And apparently, and to one degree, I feel that they're holding Ukraine hostage to the border. So we've got to do both at the same time. It can't be one without the other. And I think that then becomes where we move past the impasse. And I think that's what the Senate is going to do. The Senate is going to come out with a bill that does both. Does something on the border and does something and gives funding to Ukraine. Basically, what the president had been asking for is just that, because he put out 4 things for the supplemental. But we can't do one, say, to do border without Ukraine or vice versa. We got to do both collectively.
Are you glad that the president got involved? And take us through what the president was saying in the room, how effective he was in there.
Well, the president showed his vast foreign relations and foreign policy experience, how he has kept the world together, quite frankly. When you look at what he's done with our European allies, they are stronger now. NATO is stronger now than it's ever been. primarily because of the work and the expertise of the president. When you look at also the work that he's done with South Korea and Japan and what they're doing to contribute and help Ukraine is really important. So I think that it was important for the president, his expertise that he has from the experience that he has now as president, as vice president, as the former chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That was tremendously important.
He has a lot of experience, as we know, on foreign affairs. Thank you so much, Congressman Gregory Meeks, for rushing out and talking to us. We'll be back, of course, tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. Thank you so much. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.